Imagine a valley where the air is thick with the scent of roasted coffee and the damp, heavy earth of the Andes. This is Medellín, Colombia, a city that breathes with a rhythm all its own. In the late 1970s, it was a place of vibrant color and desperate poverty. But beneath the surface, a shadow was lengthening, cast by a man who would eventually become a god to some and a demon to the rest of the world. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria wasn't born with a silver spoon. He was born with a hunger that no amount of money could ever truly satisfy. Born in 1949 in the town of Rio Negro, Escobar's childhood was a masterclass in survival. The son of a humble farmer and a schoolteacher, he looked at the dirt beneath his fingernails and decided he wanted gold instead. He started small, working the angles of street-level hustles and petty thefts. There are stories, perhaps legendary but deeply revealing, of a young Pablo sanding the names off headstones in local cemeteries to resell them to grieving families. It's a chilling image, a teenager erasing the identities of the dead to provide for the living. This wasn't just a crime, it was an early manifestation of a psychological blueprint defined by a complete lack of empathy for the other and an insatiable, narcissistic drive to conquer. By the time the mid-70s rolled around, the world's appetite for cocaine was exploding like a powder keg. Escobar didn't just find the fuse, he owned the match. He pivoted from smuggling cigarettes and stolen cars to the white gold that would define his legacy. He wasn't just a trafficker, he was a visionary of the underworld. He viewed the logistics of the trade like a grandmaster sees a chessboard. He understood that in a country struggling with deep-seated corruption and staggering inequality, power wasn't just about who had the biggest gun. It was about who held the leash. This is where the paradox of the king of cocaine takes root. To the dwellers of the comunas, the hillside slums, he was a savior. He built soccer fields where there was only dust. He constructed entire housing projects for families who had lived in garbage dumps. He was Don Pablo, the man who shared the wealth that the government had hoarded for decades. But this performative empathy was a cold, calculated strategy. It was a human shield made of flesh and loyalty. While he kissed babies in the streets of Medellín, he was perfecting a philosophy that would bring the Colombian state to its knees. Plata o Plomo. Silver or lead. It was a simple, binary choice. Accept the bribe and become a ghost in his machine, or refuse it and feel the cold weight of a bullet. It wasn't just a threat. It was a systematic dismantling of the rule of law. Judges, police officers, and politicians found themselves at a crossroads where every path led to blood or betrayal. The silent witnesses to this era weren't just the bodies in the morgue. They were the meticulously kept ledgers found in hidden compartments, detailing millions of dollars flowing like water, and the charred remains of those who dared to say no. Escobar's mind was a fortress of contradictions. He was a doting father who once reportedly burned $2 million in cash just to keep his shivering daughter warm in a mountain hideout. Yet he was a monster who would order the bombing of a commercial airliner just to kill one man. He was the most successful businessman in history, landing on the Forbes list of billionaires while being the most wanted fugitive on the planet. As we stand at the threshold of this story, the air in Medellín grows cold, because in late 1989, the world would realize that Pablo Escobar wasn't just fighting for market share. He was declaring war on reality itself. And the first casualty was about to be the soul of a nation. To understand the monster that would eventually bring a superpower to its knees, we have to look at the dirt he grew from. It was 1949 in Rio Negro, a rural enclave in the department of Antioquia. The air was thin, the soil was hard, and for a poor farming family, life was a repetitive cycle of labor and lack. His father was a humble cattle farmer, his mother, a school teacher. But Pablo didn't want the harvest. He wanted the kingdom. He watched the way the world worked, how the wealthy moved with an invisible armor of influence, and he decided, even as a child, that he would never be the one holding the plow. There is a chilling legend about young Pablo, a story that serves as the ultimate metaphor for his psychological architecture. Before the billions, before the bombings, he allegedly profited from the erasure of the dead. He would enter local cemeteries under the cover of night, stealing marble headstones from their plots. He would sand off the names of the departed, polishing the stone until it was a blank slate, and then resell them to grieving families in need of a bargain. This was his first forensic footprint, the fine white dust of the dead under his fingernails. It showed a burgeoning narcissistic detachment, a mind that viewed the most sacred boundaries of human respect as nothing more than a supply chain. By the time he hit the streets of Medellín as a teenager, the petty thief was evolving into a predator. He dropped out of the University of Antioquia, not because he lacked the intellect, but because he lacked the patience for a life of slow, honest gains. The streets offered a faster curriculum. He moved into the smuggling underworld, dealing in contraband cigarettes and stolen cars. But Pablo wasn't just a thief. He was a student of human nature. He realized early on that power wasn't just about the money you held, but the fear you could manufacture. Looking at him through a clinical lens, Escobar exhibited the classic traits of antisocial personality disorder, masked by a terrifying charisma. He possessed a dualistic personality that allowed him to be a doting father and a cold-blooded executioner in the same hour. To the destitute residents of Medellín's slums, he began to craft a Robin Hood persona, building housing projects and soccer fields. But this wasn't altruism. It was strategic insurance. He was buying the silence and loyalty of the poor, creating a human shield of thousands who would later be willing to die to protect his right to kill. This was where the infamous ultimatum was born. Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. It was a binary restructuring of Colombian society. If you were a judge, a cop, or a politician, Pablo presented you with a choice that was no choice at all. You either accepted his bribe and became a silent partner in his atrocity, or you maintained your integrity and waited for the sound of a motorcycle engine outside your window. He was systematically dismantling the machinery of the state, one bullet and one briefcase at a time. As the 1970s dawned, the petty crimes of his youth began to feel small. The margins on cigarettes and cars were too thin for a man with his hunger. He began to look toward the thick, humid jungles of Peru and Bolivia, where a specific green leaf was being processed into a crude white paste. It was a substance that promised a high unlike any other, and for a man with Pablo's ambition, it represented a golden ticket to the top of the world. He didn't just want to be a smuggler anymore. He wanted to be an emperor. And the first step toward the throne required him to eliminate the very people who had opened the door for him. Pablo was about to learn that in the world of high-stakes narcotics, loyalty is a luxury you can't afford, and the path to absolute power is paved with the bodies of your mentors. The first real blood was about to be spilled, and once the fountain started, it would never stop. By the mid-1970s, the cocaine trade was a disorganized mess of small-time mules and fragmented routes. To Pablo, it looked like a gold mine guarded by toddlers. His mentor, Fabio Restrepo, was a man of the old world. He dealt in prestige and slow-moving connections, a relic of a time when the underworld had a glass ceiling. But Pablo was a shark who had tasted blood and realized the ocean was infinite. In 1975, Restrepo met a violent end, riddled with bullets that served as Pablo's unofficial coronation. There was no mourning period. Before Restrepo's body was even cold, Escobar was already folding the man's entire operation into his own. He didn't just step into the shoes of a kingpin, he burned the old shoes and paved a highway. This was the birth of the white gold rush. We aren't talking about small bags hidden in false-bottomed suitcases anymore. We're talking about a logistical revolution. Pablo looked at the map of the Americas and saw a giant funnel. At the top was the United States, a country entering a hedonistic decade, its nostrils wide open for the high that only Colombia's mountains could provide. At the bottom was Pablo, the man with the keys to the kingdom. In June 1976, Pablo faced his first real test of the new era. He and his cousin Gustavo Gaviria were caught returning from Ecuador with 39 pounds of cocaine paste hidden in the spare tire of their truck. It was a sloppy mistake, a rare lapse in a career defined by precision. But it was in the damp, gray confines of a Medellín jail cell that the Plata o Plomo philosophy truly crystallized. Pablo didn't beg for mercy. He offered a deal. He looked the judge and the arresting officers in the eye with a gaze that was disturbingly flat, a void where empathy should have been. He offered them more money than they would earn in 3 lifetimes to let the case vanish. When they hesitated, he didn't raise his voice. He simply began reciting the names of their wives, the schools their children attended, and the routes they took home. The case didn't just fall apart, it evaporated. The arresting officers were murdered shortly after, and the legal record seemingly dissolved into the ether. This wasn't just a lucky break, it was a proof of concept. Pablo realized that the law wasn't a wall, it was a curtain that could be pulled back with enough silver or burned down with enough lead. By 1977, the scale of his ambition became industrial. Deep in the emerald canopy of the Colombian jungle, the silent witnesses of his rise were the makeshift laboratories. These weren't sterile medical facilities. They were humid, fly-blown shacks reeking of sulfuric acid, gasoline, and ether. Here, the raw coca leaves were transformed into a crystalline powder that was more valuable than its weight in 24-karat gold. Pablo's fleet grew from a single plane to a literal air force of Piper Cubs and Cessnas. Each flight was a high-stakes gamble, low-flying ghosts skimming the Caribbean waves to avoid radar, carrying the fuel for an American fire that would never be extinguished. But as the money began to pile up in literal mountains, stacked in damp basements and buried in plastic drums, so did the bodies. Pablo was no longer just a man. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature that the world was not prepared to contain. He was building a throne of white powder, but the foundation was starting to crack under the weight of his own hubris. The scent of blood was attracting more than just local rivals. Far to the north, in the halls of Washington, D.C., a new kind of enemy was waking up, and they were bringing a set of handcuffs that even Pablo's silver couldn't melt. The golden age of the smuggler was about to collide with the cold reality of an international manhunt, and the first casualty would be the peace of an entire nation. The war for the soul of Colombia had just received its first shipment of ammunition, of his own hubris. The scent of blood was attracting more than just local rivals. Far to the north, in the halls of Washington, D.C., a new kind of enemy was waking up, and they were bringing a set of handcuffs that even Pablo's silver couldn't melt. The golden age of the smuggler was about to collide with the cold reality of an international manhunt, and the first casualty would be the peace of an entire nation. The war for the soul of Colombia had just received its first shipment of ammunition. Plata o Plomo. In the 1980s, these 3 words became the unofficial motto of the Republic of Colombia. It was a binary code for survival. Silver or lead. For a judge, a police captain, or a cabinet minister, the choice was rarely about morality. It was about the cold, hard math of mortality. Pablo Escobar didn't just buy people. He bought their peace of mind. And if the soul wasn't for sale, he took the life as a tax on their integrity. Imagine a manila folder landing on your desk. Inside, there isn't just a stack of high-denomination American bills. There are photos of your children walking to school, your wife at the market, the exact color of your front door. That was the silver. The lead was the inevitable follow-up, a drive-by on a rain-slicked Bogotá street, the rhythmic rattle of a Mac-10, and the heavy silence that followed. But Pablo wanted more than the shadows. He craved the sun. He wasn't satisfied with being the wealthiest ghost in the world. He wanted the legitimacy of the throne. In 1982, he successfully pivoted from the jungle to the ballot box, being elected as a substitute representative to the Colombian Congress. He began wearing suits that felt slightly too tight on his frame, trying to mask the scent of gasoline and ether from his jungle labs with the expensive musk of high society. He was the Robin Hood of Medellín, funding housing projects for the destitute, while his lieutenants were tallying the body counts in the barrios. To the poor, he was a saint in a polo shirt. To the state, he was a cancer in the legislature. However, the mask was slipping. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the newly appointed Minister of Justice, refused to look the other way. He was a man of steel in an era of melting ethics. He saw through the charade, identifying the self-made businessman as a common criminal who had infiltrated the hallowed halls of government. Lara Bonilla began to pull at the threads of Pablo's empire, exposing the blood-soaked foundations of his wealth and pushing for his expulsion from Congress. The narco-culture was finally facing a head-on collision with the rule of law. The tension reached its breaking point on the evening of April 30th, 1984. Lara Bonilla was being driven through the streets of northern Bogotá in a white Mercedes-Benz. He knew he was a marked man. He had refused the silver. He had chosen the lead. At approximately 7 p.m., 2 assassins on a high-speed Yamaha motorcycle pulled alongside the Mercedes. 7 bullets from a .45 caliber submachine gun tore through the glass, ending the life of the man who dared to say no to the king of cocaine. The assassination didn't just kill a man, it shattered the illusion that Pablo could be reasoned with or contained by the traditional gears of democracy. President Belisario Betancur, who had once been hesitant to fully engage, signed the extradition treaty with the United States almost before Lara Bonilla's body was cold. This was the one thing Pablo feared more than death: a jail cell in the United States, a place where his money couldn't buy the guards or the keys. He didn't retreat into the mountains. Instead, he decided to declare war on the state itself. He wasn't going to hide in the basement anymore. He was going to burn the house down with everyone inside. And he knew exactly where to strike next to ensure the law would never touch him again. The target wasn't a person this time. It was the very building where justice was written, and the massacre that followed would stain the floor of the Supreme Court for generations. But while the halls of justice were choked with the smell of cordite and scorched paper, a few miles away in the slums of Medellín, Pablo Escobar was being canonized. This was the masterstroke of a man who understood that if you want to be a king, you don't just need an army, you need a congregation. To the international community, the Palace of Justice siege was a terrifying display of narco-terrorist reach. But to the thousands living in the city's northeastern hills, Pablo wasn't the man behind the machine guns. He was the man who had given them a home. In the early 1980s, Escobar had looked at the sprawling, desperate poverty of his hometown and saw more than just a labor pool for his cocaine labs. He saw a bulletproof vest made of human loyalty. He began a massive social project called Medellín Without Slums, pouring $60 million into housing, clinics, and soccer fields. He didn't just build these places, he walked through them. He kissed babies, shook calloused hands, and handed out thick stacks of pesos like a benevolent uncle. This was the saint of the slums, a persona crafted with the clinical precision of a man who knew exactly how to manipulate the human heart The silent witnesses of this period tell a story of calculated duality. There were the thousands of bricks stamped with his name, and then there were the private ledgers recording the Plata o Plomo payments that funded them. The gold-plated Rolex on his wrist ticked with a cold, mechanical certainty, a reminder that the silver was always backed by the lead. This wasn't charity, it was a strategic investment. By feeding the hungry, he turned the entire city into a massive intelligence network. Every child with a new bicycle was a lookout. Every grandmother with a roof over her head was a potential safe house. Escobar's psychological profile during this era reveals a man consumed by a narcissistic need for legitimacy. He didn't just want the money, he wanted the respect of the elite who looked down on his peasant roots. In 1982, he was elected as an alternate to the Chamber of Representatives. He walked into the halls of power wearing the same smile he used when handing out soccer balls, genuinely believing that his Robin Hood image would act as a forensic shield against his criminal reality. But he underestimated the courage of Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. Bonilla saw through the saint. On the floor of the Congress, he didn't just debate policy. He presented the physical evidence of Escobar's true nature, the 1976 arrest record for drug trafficking that Pablo thought he had successfully erased. The public humiliation was a behavioral trigger that shattered Pablo's carefully curated mask. The narcissistic injury was deep, and the reaction was lethal. He had tried to buy his way into the establishment with Plata, and when they refused, he reverted to his signature methodology, Plomo. On an April evening in 1984, two hitmen on a red Yamaha motorcycle intercepted Lara Bonilla's Mercedes-Benz. The forensic evidence left at the scene, the shattered glass, the 7 9mm casings, and the lifeless body of a cabinet minister, marked the official end of the saint and the birth of the terrorist. Escobar retreated into the hills he had bought, protected by the very people he had saved. But the war was just beginning. He had shown the world he could kill a minister. Now, he was looking for a target that would make the Palace of Justice look like a rehearsal. He wasn't just coming for the law anymore. He was coming for the very air the nation breathed, and his next move would be a mid-air massacre that would force the world to finally look the devil in the eye. The morning of November 27th, 1989, broke over Bogotá with a deceptive, crystal-clear beauty. At El Dorado International Airport, Avianca Flight 203, a Boeing 727, prepared for a routine hop to Cali. Among the 107 souls on board were families heading on vacation, couples holding hands, and businessmen finishing their morning coffee. But nestled in the belly of the plane was a silent passenger, a briefcase packed with high-velocity explosives. It had been carried onto the aircraft by a young man, a suicide bomber, who didn't even know he was a ghost. He had been told he was carrying a recording device to spy on a political rival. At 7:11 a.m., the engines roared, lifting the Silver Bird into the thin Andean air. 5 minutes later, at an altitude of 13,000 feet, the sky over the town of Soacha didn't just vibrate, it fractured. A blinding flash of orange and white ripped through the fuselage, followed by a thunderous boom that echoed for miles. The aircraft didn't just fail, it disintegrated. To the horrified onlookers below, the sky seemed to rain metal, luggage, and human remains. It was a dark confetti of a nation's stability falling from a cloudless sky. The forensic evidence left behind told a story of calculated, sociopathic cruelty. Investigators sifted through the wreckage to find the silent witnesses, tiny, jagged fragments of Seat 14K, permeated with the telltale chemical signature of Semtex. This wasn't a surgical strike, it was a scorched earth massacre. Escobar's intended target, presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, had been warned by his security detail at the last minute and never boarded the flight. 107 people were murdered for a man who wasn't even there. The psychological profile of Pablo Escobar had reached a terrifying tipping point. This was no longer about the cocaine trade or the Robin Hood persona he had carefully cultivated in the slums of Medellín. This was the narcissism of a cornered predator. The threat of extradition to the United States, the one thing he feared more than death, had triggered a primal, violent response. If the Colombian state would not yield to his demands, he would dismantle the country brick by bloody brick. He was no longer a drug dealer, he was an insurgent. The carnage didn't stop in the clouds. On December 6, 1989, just 9 days after the Avianca tragedy, a bus laden with 1,100 pounds of dynamite pulled up to the DAS building, the heart of Colombia's intelligence agency. At 7:30 a.m., the ground shook with the force of a localized earthquake. The blast carved a crater 30 feet deep into the asphalt and leveled several city blocks. 52 people were vaporized or crushed instantly, and nearly 1,000 were wounded by the rain of concrete and glass. The extraditables, Escobar's collective of narco-terrorists, soon released a chilling manifesto that summarized their blood-soaked philosophy. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a cell in the United States. The message was clear. There were no non-combatants in this war. Every citizen was a potential casualty. Every street corner was a front line. But even as Escobar sat in his mountain fortress, basking in the terror he had sown, he failed to realize that his overreach had created a monster. Even he couldn't control. His atrocities had finally forced the hands of the most powerful intelligence agencies on the planet. The United States and the Colombian elite were no longer coming to make an arrest. They were coming for blood, and the first shot would come from a shadow Escobar never saw standing behind him. His own people were beginning to whisper. The whispers were no longer just background noise. They were the sound of the foundation cracking. By 1991, Pablo Escobar was a man cornered by his own ambition, yet he managed to pull off the ultimate sleight of hand. On June 19th, he surrendered to the Colombian government. But the optics were a lie. This wasn't a defeat, it was a rebranding. The terms were dictated by the criminal, not the state. No extradition to the United States, and the right to build his own prison. They called it La Catedral, but it was less a house of God and more a monument to a narcissist's ego. Perched 7,000 feet up on a misty mountainside overlooking Medellín, the facility was a 5-star resort wrapped in a thin veil of justice. Inside, the silent witnesses were not iron bars or cold stone, but leather sofas, a full-sized soccer pitch, a billiards room, and a bar stocked with the finest European liquors. Escobar sat by a giant telescope, literally looking down on the city he once ruled from the shadows, watching his empire pulse beneath him like a heartbeat. He was a spider sitting in the center of a silk web made of law. But the air at that altitude was thin, and the isolation fed a growing, jagged paranoia. Escobar's psyche was a house of mirrors. He believed he was the architect of a new order, a king in exile. Yet, behind the charismatic mask of the people's hero, the antisocial personality traits were sharpening into a razor edge. He wasn't just managing his business, he was micromanaging the lives and deaths of his associates. The golden cage was becoming a pressure cooker of suspicion. The true nature of the sanctuary revealed itself in the summer of 1992. Two of his top lieutenants, Gerardo Moncada and Fernando Galeano, were summoned to the mountain. They were the men keeping the Medellín cartel's engine running while the boss was locked away. But Escobar's ledger was written in blood and suspicion. He accused them of skimming $20 million from the profits. In the heart of his luxury fortress, the facade of the benevolent leader shattered. Moncada and Galeano didn't leave La Catedral. They were tortured, executed, and their bodies reportedly dismembered and burned right there on the prison grounds. The very place the government had promised would contain the violence had become a slaughterhouse. The forensic reality was chilling. Escobar hadn't retired from the game. He had moved the game into a fortified bunker where the law couldn't reach him. He was ordering hits between sets of tennis and sips of vintage scotch. While the world outside thought the king of cocaine was finally neutralized, the Colombian government was waking up to a terrifying realization. They hadn't caged a tiger. They had given him a castle and a private army. The pressure from Washington was reaching a fever pitch. The DEA and Delta Force were tracking the signals, the ghost-like whispers of satellite phones emanating from the mountain. They realized that as long as Escobar sat on that hill, he was untouchable. The Colombian president, Cesar Gaviria, finally realized the depth of the betrayal. He ordered the military to move in, to transfer Escobar to a real prison, a cage made of steel, not silk. But the mountain had eyes. As the Colombian Army's 4th Brigade began their ascent through the thick Andean fog on July 22, 1992, they found the golden cage was empty. Pablo Escobar hadn't just walked out. He had vanished into the mist, turning a controlled surrender into a declaration of total war. And this time, there would be no deals. The hunt was no longer about justice. It was about the final, bloody erasure of a legend that had become too large to live. But as the dawn broke over the empty cells of La Catedral, a new, even darker force was assembling in the shadows, a group whose cruelty would make even Escobar's cartel look like amateurs, and they were already closing in on his scent. The Colombian government didn't just want Pablo back, they wanted him erased. President Cesar Gaviria, humiliated by the escape from La Catedral, realized that the time for negotiations had passed into the realm of myth. The state authorized the creation of the Bloc de Búsqueda, the search block, a specialized unit of 500 men, led by the incorruptible Colonel Hugo Martinez. Their mission was singular: find Escobar or die trying. But the official manhunt was only the surface of a much deeper, more visceral conflict. While the search block operated with the precision of a scalpel, a shadowy organization known as Los Pepes functioned like a serrated blade. An acronym for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, this group was a nightmare alliance of rival cartels, vengeful former associates, and rogue elements of the security forces. They weren't interested in due process or handcuffs. They spoke Pablo's language of calculated savagery, but with a terrifying new fluency. By early 1993, the streets of Medellín had transformed into a surreal gallery of the macabre. Los Pepes began a systematic dismantling of Escobar's inner circle, not by targeting his soldiers, but by liquidating his infrastructure. They blew up his vintage car collections, torched his mansions, and assassinated his lawyers in broad daylight. The silent witnesses of this era weren't found in a laboratory. They were the charred remains of the Hacienda Nápoles and the bullet-riddled bodies left with signs pinned to their chests, warning that anyone who aided the kingpin would share their fate. Escobar, a man whose narcissistic personality disorder thrived on being the ultimate arbiter of life and death, found himself on the receiving end of his own Plata o Plomo ultimatum. For the first time, the silver was gone, and there was only lead. The psychological toll on Escobar was profound. He was a creature of comfort and control, a man who once sat on a literal throne of cocaine. Now, he was reduced to a phantom, haunting the urban sprawl of Medellín. He moved between safe houses every 24 hours, often sleeping in cramped, windowless rooms or behind false walls. His only connection to the outside world was a handheld radio, its crackling static a constant reminder of his isolation. Above him, the sky was filled with the invisible eyes of the Americans. The U.S. government had deployed Centra Spike, a top-secret electronic surveillance unit that utilized sophisticated direction-finding equipment. They weren't looking for a person, they were looking for a frequency. Every time Pablo pressed the talk button to check on his family or issue an order, he was painting a digital bullseye on his own back. Yet, despite the high-tech dragnet and the vigilante terror, Escobar remained elusive. His deep-seated connection to the barrios, the loyalty he had bought with soccer fields and housing projects, provided him with a human shield of lookouts and informants. He was a trapped animal, but a trapped animal is at its most dangerous. His paranoia deepened. His empathy, always a selective trait, evaporated entirely. He began to see traitors in every shadow, ordering the executions of his own men on mere suspicion. The hunt had become a war of attrition, a grueling test of nerves between a fading legend and a coalition of enemies who had forgotten the meaning of mercy. By the autumn of 1993, the circle had tightened to a suffocating degree. The kingpin was running out of places to hide, and more importantly, he was running out of people to trust. The end wasn't going to be a grand cinematic standoff. It was going to be a desperate scramble through the mud. As December approached, a single intercepted phone call would change everything. It was a call filled with the mundane details of a father's love, a moment of uncharacteristic weakness that would provide the final coordinate. The king of cocaine was about to learn that in the world of high-stakes pursuit, silence isn't just golden. It's the only thing that keeps you alive. And the silence was about to be broken by the sound of boots on a rooftop, going to be a desperate scramble through the mud. As December approached, a single intercepted phone call would change everything. It was a call filled with the mundane details of a father's love, a moment of uncharacteristic weakness that would provide the final coordinate. The king of cocaine was about to learn that in the world of high-stakes pursuit, silence isn't just golden, it's the only thing that keeps you alive. And the silence was about to be broken by the sound of boots on a rooftop. For 18 months after his brazen escape from the luxury prison of La Catedral, Pablo Escobar lived like a ghost, haunting his own kingdom. But the ghost was tired. Gone were the days of gold-plated faucets and private zoos filled with hippos and giraffes. The man who once offered to pay off Colombia's $20 billion national debt was now reduced to a series of damp, claustrophobic safe houses. His world, once as vast as the Andean horizon, had shrunk to the four walls of a modest, middle-class home in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín. This was the psychological unraveling of a titan. Narcissism is a heavy armor. It protects the ego, but it weighs down the man. Escobar's antisocial personality traits, which had allowed him to order the deaths of thousands without a flicker of remorse, were now clashing with the only thing he truly valued: his family. To the world, he was a narco-terrorist, a monster who had turned a beautiful country into a graveyard. But in his own mind, he was a martyr, a misunderstood patriarch being hunted by an ungrateful nation. The search block, a specialized unit of the Colombian National Police, had become a surgical instrument. They were no longer just kicking down doors. They were dissecting the airwaves. Led by the relentless Colonel Hugo Martinez, they utilized sophisticated electronic surveillance provided by American intelligence. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of radio frequencies. The silent witness in this hunt wasn't a person, but a signal, a jagged green line on a spectrum analyzer. While Pablo paced the floors of house number 45D-94, the walls were closing in metaphorically and literally. The Los Pepes, a paramilitary death squad fueled by his rivals and former victims, were systematically dismantling his organization, executing his lawyers, and burning his properties. He was a king without an army, a billionaire who couldn't buy a night of peaceful sleep. The stress had turned his hair gray and his movements sluggish. He was 44 years old, but in fugitive years, he was an ancient man. On December 2nd, 1993, a day after his birthday, the king of cocaine made his final mistake. He picked up the phone. He knew the rules. He had spent a decade teaching his lieutenants that a telephone was a death warrant. But the father outweighed the fugitive. He called his son, Juan Pablo, staying on the line for more than 6 minutes. He spoke of the mundane, of his love, of a future that was already a fiction. In the back of a nondescript white van cruising the streets of Medellín, the equipment chirped. The signal was strong. The triangulation was perfect. The digital bloodhound had caught the scent. The technicians didn't see a man. They saw a coordinate. As the search block converged on the block, the neighborhood was bathed in the orange glow of a Colombian afternoon. Pablo was sitting at a small table, a plate of half-eaten food before him, unaware that the mathematics of his own hubris had finally added up to 0. He heard the screech of tires, the heavy thud of tactical boots, and the splintering of wood. He grabbed his Sig Sauer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and headed for the only exit left, the terracotta tiles of the roof. But as he scrambled upward, he realized he wasn't running toward freedom. He was running into the sights of a dozen rifles. A small table, a plate of half-eaten food before him, unaware that the mathematics of his own hubris had finally added up to 0. He heard the screech of tires, the heavy thud of tactical boots, and the splintering of wood. He grabbed his Sig Sauer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and headed for the only exit left, the terracotta tiles of the roof. But as he scrambled upward, he realized he wasn't running toward freedom. He was running into the sights of a dozen rifles. The afternoon air in the Los Olivos neighborhood was thick, heavy with the scent of tropical humidity and the metallic tang of impending rain. It was 2:50 p.m. on December 2nd, 1993. Pablo, barefoot and desperate, heaved his heavy, aging frame through the window and onto the roof. Behind him, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as Limon, his last faithful bodyguard, was already crumpling under a hail of lead. The orange terracotta tiles were slick, a precarious and unforgiving stage for the final act of a man who once owned the very sky above him. Major Hugo Martinez Jr. and his search block team didn't hesitate. The silence of the residential street was fractured by the staccato rhythm of M16s and Sig Sauers. Pablo fired back, a frantic, jagged response, but the geometry of the roof offered no cover. The physics of the situation were absolute. 3 bullets found their mark. One struck his leg, another his torso. But it was the third, a 9mm round, that entered just behind his right ear and exited through his left temple, that silenced the king of cocaine forever. For years, Escobar had famously declared that he would rather have a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the United States. He had told his family repeatedly, "I will kill myself before they take me." To this day, the trajectory of that final bullet remains the ultimate forensic Rorschach test. Was it a soldier's triumph or Pablo's final desperate act of control? As his blood seeped into the porous clay tiles, staining the roof the color of a bruised sunset, the search block gathered. They didn't just secure the scene, they posed. They stood over the bloated, bearded corpse like big game hunters over a fallen lion, their smiles captured in a flashbulb moment that would become the most haunting trophy photo of the 20th century. But the death of the man did not signal the death of the monster. The mathematics of hubris left behind a remainder that Colombia struggled to solve. The Medellín cartel shattered, but its shards were razor sharp. The Cali cartel was already waiting in the wings, and the vacuum left by Escobar's demise was filled not by peace, but by a more corporate, invisible, and efficient brand of violence. We look at the silent witnesses left in his wake, the gold-plated pistols, the crumbling ruins of Hacienda Nápoles, the hollowed-out statues once filled with white powder. They tell the story of a man who mistook fear for loyalty and narco-terrorism for a legacy. Pablo Escobar died on a roof, barefoot and alone, a far cry from the billionaire who once offered to pay off his country's entire national debt. Yet, as the sun sets over the jagged peaks of the Andes, the scars he carved into the soul of a nation remain raw. The ghosts of the judges, the journalists, and the thousands of innocent victims still whisper in the Medellín breeze. They serve as a chilling reminder that while the king is dead, the throne he built was never truly destroyed. It was simply moved deeper into the shadows. And in those shadows, the next Pablo is always watching, waiting for the mathematics of his own ambition to begin, proving that the most dangerous thing about a monster isn't his life, but the blueprint he leaves behind for those who follow.